Hey, welcome in, folks. It's Coach and the Commentator with Joe and Jon Crispin. I am ESPN college basketball analyst Jon Crispin. He is brother Joe, head coach of Rowan University men's basketball. He's the coach part of this conversation. He also tends to be the expert. One of the comments that I saw, Joe, on YouTube was that Joe talks 80% of the time. It's crazy. Never thought I'd hear that.
Wait, that was an actual comment?
No, it wasn't. It's just something I was hoping to see. I was hoping to see that because every time I'm in studio, the guys always say I talk like it's like 70-30. You know, it's not it's not like a 50-50 ball. It's a 70-30 ball.
That's because as the commentator, you're better at setting me up than I am at you, right?
Yeah, but
it's the opposite of when we were on the court.
But it also goes back to the point you were making. I think you and I were just talking, and I think this is where a lot of this comes from, is we just talk about these things. And I was talking about coaching, and you turned it from coaching to teaching. And the conversation wasn't just about how to coach. The conversation was like, you got to know what to teach, when to teach it, and you got to know how to teach it. And then it led to a lot of other things that there's
even in what order.
There's truth in the doing part of this. And I'm telling you, I do it. There's times where I write stuff, I think stuff, I really think through my thoughts and I process things. I write them out. I actually read them back to myself a lot of times because I want to see if it makes sense to me. You know, a lot of times we have thoughts that when you actually read it out loud, you're like, man, I don't think anybody's going to get that. Because a lot of times it's the process that gets you to a certain point that you say, all right, if I'm not in that process, that makes no sense. Right. But your process takes you to a point of truth. And that you say, all right, this is how I'm going to go about things. So as a commentator, it's kind of easy to think in things of theory, or think of things just in theory. And in a way,
they always work.
They always work, right? They always work. It's the guy that says they should have done this, and that means they would have won the game, right? It's like, well, no, it could have been worse. You know, they could have lost by 30 and not 20. And it kind of brings us back to that like conversation we talked about having about identity. And the conversation was going to be about, programs with identity and Purdue and Wisconsin, kind of the type of it. I've heard Seth Greenberg say a lot. You have to impose your identity on the game, which sometimes I laugh at him because he's coach and he laughs at me and picks on me. So I might as well do the same. But he's not wrong, but you got to have it to impose it. And one of the things recently that happened that locally for us was, I don't want to say a big deal, but for a lot of people here in the Philadelphia, South Jersey area, the Eagles going back to the Super Bowl is a ridiculously huge deal.
Probably very big deal.
Well, yeah, I mean, to the point where, like, let's be honest, like you got grown adults climbing telephone poles. Like anytime the city's got to spend money to grease telephone poles, there's got to be a part of you, if you're whoever's that's doing this, has got to be like, are we serious? Like, we're trying to grease these poles so they don't climb them because they will die when they fall off of them. And people will do that. Did
they already start that? Did they already?
I think they already did. Yeah, they showed some video downtown. It was crazy. And
you got to win it before. You got to win it before that starts going. Come on.
Interview local people, and it kills me because that's why I'm like, that's what people think when I say I'm from Jersey, and it's like I had a really bad disease to the point where I took my colon. And people are like, oh my gosh, you had to have your colon removed? What happened? And I'm like, well, I had severe ulcerative colitis. And they're always like, ugh. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a cool one. You know what I mean? And that's kind of what I think of when they show some Philly people who are, they had a good time watching the game. And then they interview those people with that strong accent that I've really tried to avoid. Wooder, talk, walk, like that, just that harsh accent. You hear it and you're like, ah. That's why people, when I say I'm from New Jersey, they go, ooh. Like, it's like I have severe ulcerative colitis. Ooh, that one. Like, when I lived in Los Angeles, that's the response I got. And part of it was people watch things like Jersey Shore, and they watched enough Eagles games to know that fan base is nuts. So there's a part of me that's happy for him. There's another part of me that's like, gosh, we got another week of this stuff. But it is all good. We were around for the last Super Bowl. That was a lot of fun. But to get to the point of the conversation, if I can, identity. You had talked about what you liked about Nick Sirianni's post-game interview, because some of the things he talked about, but ultimately you probably only like it because you saw consistencies with what he's talking about throughout the course of the season. Is that a piece of it?
Yeah, I mean, the thing he mentioned in his post-game comment, and I think something that I've seen throughout the year, if there's the favorite football team in my house are the Steelers because of, Aaron's family.
Oh,
And the kids are all
you have
Steelers
Pittsburgh
out.
dad. So you have Pittsburgh dad, and we got Philly peeps. Like
Yeah,
we
Pittsburgh
got
Dag's pretty
John.
funny.
We got
But
Philly
I always
John.
root for the Eagles. I always want the Eagles to win.
Yeah.
I can sleep if they lose. It's not that big a deal to me. But
True.
I'm always happy to see them win. But one of the things he said in that post-game comment is just about being tough. He didn't use the term Philly tough, but he talked about it, what kind of city it is and how they want to represent the city as a football team. And I just thought, you know what? They have. Like, Sirianni's got an edge to him. He's got a toughness to him.
He's got a swagger to him, too.
Yeah, he's got swagger. He's kind of got the, like, I'm ready to take you on mentality. And his team has that, right? Now they have, Jalen Hurts is kind of an underdog that people are easy to root for Jalen Hurts. And how can you not root for him? I think he's just, his interview after he got after he sat down at halftime for Tua is just one of my all-time favorites. I show it to my team usually once a year, because he's just such a stud and he's a winner and he's just a dude.
I don't know about that post-game purple Michael Jackson jacket he was wearing though. That was weird.
Well, yeah,
criticize fashion.
I don't know what happens
either way.
The whole fashion thing. I can't get my mind around any of that, right? But he mentioned that, and I just thought, like, there's a guy who gets it, right? Is that and I think this is true in the professional sports world. It's especially true in the college sports world, where you talk about matching your identity to the people and the group or the community that you represent.
Yep.
I just think it's like it's going with the grain, right? It's doing things the way they should be done.
Or it's just not fighting the reality, which you often point out as your limitations, right? Don't fight the limitations.
That's what I mean by going with the grain. You're not going against the grain. You're going with the grain, right? You're driving with the wind. You're running with the wind here. Like, it's good to be faithful to who you, not just who you say you are, but who you actually are. Because sometimes institutions say they're one thing, right? And one of the things I always tell people, like, even though we lived here, we grew up here, I didn't know Rowan, right? I didn't really know Rowan.
Mom went there.
Yeah, well, Dad got his master's. Like, we worked out there all the time. I didn't know the institution itself. I didn't know it in my bones, so to speak.
Whose fault would you say that is?
Well, that's a weakness of Rowan, right? There's a lack of community connection with through sports. That's something that we're working on. But I think in general, Rowan was in flux. The school was in flux, right? So that, but I thought maybe it had shifted because of some of our programs, but really it hadn't. It was still, in large part, just a bigger and better version of what they've always been. Servicing students of just various capacities, various backgrounds, some high-level students, some kids coming out of JUCO, some, with money, some not so much money. Like, you just get a wide range of diversity.
Kind of the Rowan College of South Jersey, Gloucester County College system, where you can basically transfer into Rowan. I mean, similar like a Penn State satellite, but it was an affordable education.
And your state, for example, like your state school programs, you have kids who are really good academic. If they're from lower income families, they could be great academically, especially minority students. They could go to a certain program, right? It doesn't have to be minority students, but there's some different programs for them. But, good students can go to school in large part for free using the community college system and then coming to Rowan. Well, that changes the dynamic of your institution compared to a private school, in the same way that representing Philly is different than New York or, Massachusetts, again, New England Patriots, or Miami, right? Like, there's a different vibe to every community, even for the professional sports world. So when you match up your identity as a program, right, whether it's a professional sports program or a college sports program, I think you're running with the wind, right? True. You're doing things the way they should be done. And are there exceptions?
It's easier for people to follow too. They recognize it, whether it feels familiar to people.
I think that's it. They recognize it in their gut. It feels right. It's like, I like this group. Why? They don't sit there and do a sociological study and say, oh, it's because they represent us and look at Philly and look, this is what we're like. No, they just know it.
Well,
right?
look at the Phillies without Bryce Harper, or if Bryce Harper is one of the other major stars out there. Bryce Harper fit this year, right? Like he came back from being hurt, struggled, and then delivered, right? Like that's what Philly people like.
Yeah, well, he's tough. He's got swagger. He's got an edge, right? So
all of it.
Those kind of things.
But he did deliver. If he didn't deliver,
yeah, he definitely delivered. Yeah, well, and that's also something in Philly. You better get it done, right? If
well,
not,
it's like
we'll
short,
boo you off not way, baseman. But
remember third baseman? What was his Braum or whatever the heck his name was? He ended up having a great season. He was huge in the playoffs, and he was the one that walking off the field, he was like, "I hate this freaking city." Do you remember that?
Yeah,
and he got booed, and he owned it. He owned it. He played well, and that city loves him. But same thing.
Well, yeah, and he owned it.
They appreciated his edge too.
Yeah, and they appreciated his authenticity, right?
True. That might be the word. That might be the word. Why is it that blue collar? Because Philly is definitely a blue collar city, right? Blue collar demands.
Well, Sirianni used those exact words and said
it demands a level
city.
of authenticity.
Yeah, and they want the guy who's real, right?
Yeah.
You think about some of the great Philly sports movies, right? They're underdog movies,
Invincible.
Right? So
yes, Rocky,
Invincible, Rocky.
Seriously.
They're underdog movies. So even if you're not the underdog, you should take like Bryce Harper's not the underdog. Give me a break. He was anointed as a major league player at 14,
but he was also $300 million guy, and which makes going forward interesting too. Them spending all the money. It's like
somehow
does it hurt your identity?
I think, well, we were going to talk about the Eagles, but like I think the Phillies benefited from the bad start and the coaching, the manager shift.
True.
Because then they became underdogs. Well, they have like the 4th or 5th highest payroll in baseball. They weren't underdogs. So they had to become underdogs in order to get back to where they should have been the whole time. So sometimes when we talked about identity, it's also identity is also story based. So really, no matter if I were to go work at another institution tomorrow, I would want to understand that 2 aspects of the story of the institution itself, and the story of the program itself, right? The basketball program itself. That would be the same thing like Philly, right? Is understanding somehow Philly's sports culture is a reflection of its history, right? You were a history major. I should have been a history major. I would have been more interested in school. But I think your identity is rooted in your story, right? Like it's found. It's not something you can just create. It's not just something it's something you have to discover because it's already there.
But also from a history, if I was really being a historian, I would also say a lot of history is based on what people remember. And then you have to really think about why people remember why do people talk about Buddy Ryan so much in Philadelphia, right? If you like Buddy Ryan's back on the sideline with his defense, they hated him at times, right? The old they weren't playing. But in the end, they identify with Buddy Ryan because Buddy Ryan, in a way, identifies as being one of them. That's who people remember, right? Like if you go back, you'll find a lot of Philly sports stars, like Pete Rose when he was here, Mike Schmidt. Like these guys were made into this like these gods of Philadelphia. Even Allen Iverson, if you're being real about it, Allen Iverson was a lot like that. He was an underdog.
Yeah, he was an underdog. It was a 6 foot, 160-pound dude.
Big fat
and that's
he just works, man. He's the most beloved.
But that's who fits. It's probably rooted in the Philly story, right? Like you're talking about the Revolutionary War. Like, why does it even exist? And if you really want to take it back, then
just digging into Continental Congress over here.
Yeah, I don't, my history is not amazing, but I know enough. But I think it's interesting, right? Is if you look at the history, like your story of your community, you can figure out maybe why you being plural, right? Corporate.
Yes.
Why you are the way you are, right? And a lot of
Yeah.
people, or why you value what you value, or
True.
why your
True.
team should look this way, right? And I just thought that was interesting because like he's figured that, Sirianni's figured that out, and they've adopted that identity. Like Kelsey, for example, right? Like, wasn't Kelsey when they won the Super Bowl? Like he was just like drunk and he was like spouting off on his speech, and people loved it, right? Because Kelsey's
Yeah,
a
that's right.
real dude. Like I
I
don't
believe
think it
it
was
was.
a great moment, but like the dude's real, and he's a great competitor, and he's tough, and he's a winner, and he's a team guy, and people love him for it. Well, that fits with the Philly identity,
Yeah.
right? So it's just an interesting conversation. I think people probably think when you talk like this, you're overthinking something, but I think
Nah,
what
I don't think you're
happens,
thinking enough.
yeah, I don't think people do enough thinking on this topic because naturally, I'm a coach, right? I'm a practitioner, and I have to be, I used to say this as a player too, right? I have to be true to who I am as well. Like I got to be myself. I can't try to coach in a way I don't want to coach. I can't try to, I don't know, run offense or whatever, or defense
Well,
or
yeah,
just,
I think every coaches say all coaches say that. They say like Greg Gard when he took the Wisconsin job, the first thing he said to me, I said, "Well, what pieces of Bo do you want to bring with you? Kind of what makes you different, type of thing." And he said, "Well, ultimately, I have to coach to my personality. The team needs to be a reflection of my personality." And I don't think there's a coach out there that doesn't agree with that, but there are probably layers beneath that are hard to actually achieve upon.
but also his personality and his, not just his coaching style, but the way he wants his teams to play needs to fit with the University of Wisconsin. That needs
And
to
their
fit with
history.
Wisconsin basketball, right? So it's both, right? Is yes, he has to be himself, but also that has to fit with Wisconsin, or else he needs to go somewhere else,
True.
right? I think you see that. You don't see that as much at the professional level, although I think you should. I think what happens at the professional level, it depends on the sport. Football's a little bit different. Um, Basketball, for example, it's usually the coach has to fit with the players. But in an ideal environment, those players fit in with the community itself, right? They feel at home where they are,
Okay,
right?
so is that can that be fabricated? Because that's the concern. And if you go back to Jerry Buss with the Lakers, Showtime, I know they had the show on HBO. In a way, that was fabricated. It was fabricated for, well, it was fabricated for a fabricated society. So there's that.
Well, it was. I
I'm
mean,
just
geez,
kind of
that
thinking through
show
it.
was, the show itself was absurd, wasn't it?
Yeah,
But
but Showtime, the Lakers, in the sense that like the Laker girls, they were the first to have a real dance team and not, kind of rah-rah cheerleaders with long skirts. Like they turned it into a show. Like think
yes,
of what it was under Pat Riley after Magic's initial run. Like it became a show. It was celebrities lined up. They had a
well,
club
you
there at
could.
the Forum. It
Paul
was the
Westhead
Forum
actually
Club.
started that,
Oh, Paul
in
Westhead.
some respects.
Well, I was gonna say, who was it? McKinnick?
Yeah, and he took over, and they
No,
won.
McKinnick started it. Never really got credit. The bike accident. Then
Yeah, but Westhead won that next year, right? Or no, it was that year. Maybe you're right.
it was
Well,
that year, and then the
anyway,
next year, Pat Riley took over. Wow,
I
that's
agree with you.
crazy.
Like Showtime is a great example. The Celtics, with their multiple initial dynasties, were good
Yeah,
examples,
you're right.
right? But
Did Danny Ainge and Larry Bird not freaking fit? Come on.
yeah, you had
Kevin
all these
McHale.
dudes in Boston
Come
loving
on.
those dudes. Now they also love Bill Russell. They also love, but because he was
Robert
tough and
Parrish,
he was
Bill
a winner.
Russell. Yeah.
Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson.
But
I
Detroit,
like the show. The
Lane Beer,
Showtime is
right?
a good one. The
The
Showtime
Bad
is a good
Boys,
one.
Dennis Rodman, Bill Lane Beer, Isaiah Thomas,
Yeah,
right?
blue collar community,
Tough,
bunch of hackers. I hated that team.
unlikable, unless you're
But
there.
Showtime that's a good example. That's a good example because it was a show. We want to create a show. Now I think more communities should want to create a show, but that's a different matter.
That's another conversation.
But it also teaches you who should be on board, who should be on your team, right? If you're clear about your identity, it helps you understand who should be on your team in the first place. And maybe the Eagles have done a good job of that and benefited from it.
How often, though, let's just be real about this, though, because there are a lot of times when it works and you talk to the coaches and personnel, and they're like, yeah, this is what we focus on the most. I was like, yeah, but you've been here 10 years. This is the first year I've seen it like this. I can't say that to these people, but sometimes that's what I think, where I'm like, well, where's this been every other year? Sometimes I almost feel like, because again, I think about these things probably too much. Sometimes it feels like it happened by accident. Like, do you notice that, especially in the professional sports realm, where it's almost like this just kind of happened? It was the right group and it fits our city. I feel like that happens a lot.
Oh, it happens all the time. I think even in colleges it happens. Like a coach can be rolling, just kind of doing whatever, and it just happens by accident, right? I think in an ideal environment, though, and in a highly competitive environment, you should be doing it on purpose, right? But you could make an argument too for ownership, right? And the way ownership operates, right? The way the Chiefs operate seems to fit Kansas City.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's a local person who owns the Chiefs, or a local family or whatever owns the Chiefs.
But it also kind of fits Andy Reid. And if you really get here's the challenge. And this is the thing with college sports that bothers me, is if you really get the right person to lead, and you give them the time, and the team truly can take on the identity of the right hire, you should see this more often than not. And it probably comes down to the fact that schools probably don't know who they are. Hiring process is done by a committee that has nothing to do with the school. I mean, there's a reason why.
It could be a committee, or it could be a search firm,
hiring
or whatever.
Firms. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like a hiring firm that really, like, okay, we know what you guys want to accomplish. It's like, okay, yeah, you know what we want to do on the surface. You know what our desired outcome is, which is no different than everybody else out there, right? I mean, it probably falls on the fact that we're not hiring the right people. I don't know. Like, is that the biggest issue with identity?
Yeah, I think, yeah, but
this is a tough question to answer.
You're hiring the wrong person because you don't know who you are in the first place.
Yes, that's
right.
The point.
Like you now, again, pros in college can be different, because I think in the pros, that sustainability is really, really hard, because
you
just sometimes just get burned out. It is such a demanding to be an NFL football coach, right? Like I look at Sean McVay, like how much he's invested. Has he hit a wall right now? That doesn't mean he can't regroup.
But how's Bill Belichick still tired? Like, seriously.
Well, he's got the temperament to be a football coach, that's for sure.
Andy Reid,
but the amount of hours and the work and the stress.
Andy Reid's done with. Think about Andy Reid. What Andy Reid's dealt with in terms of real life and football.
Yeah,
that is a lot, man.
Yeah,
and to have that team really kind of sustain that identity. I mean, obviously,
Pat Mahomes, and that's where
a piece of that.
Well, yeah, but you wonder, like, if the people doing the hiring are clear about what that identity really is. Because if you're not clear about who you should be, well, I guess when you're hiring somebody, and again, I've been hired plenty of times, but I've been hired when I was a great hire, and I've sometimes been hired where I've wondered, why did you bring me here? Right? As a player, it was like, you watch the film, right? This is what I do. Why'd you bring me here if you want to do it this way? I don't do it this way. I shoot transition threes. Now you're telling me you don't like transition threes. Well, you clearly didn't watch the film, right? So there's this balance of knowing who you are, knowing what your problem is, right? Knowing what your real vision is, like what your problem is, like why you have to make a hire in the first place, but then knowing like where you want to get to, right? Like what's your next step, and who can get you there? Who has experience getting you there? That's like a whole nother conversation we talk about with being ready.
But that's less outcome oriented. I think that's the thing. Like that conversation is so superficial with too many people, frankly. I said it about Indiana basketball. We're going to hang banners again. We're going to win. Indiana. I'm like, oh my God. Like another great example. It's driving me nuts already just thinking about it. It's like the outcome is the focus, when in reality, you clearly don't know who or what you are anymore.
Well, the outcome, there's nothing wrong with the outcome being a specific focus.
Not the focus.
Yeah, you have to understand what the process is, right? I mean,
if you do understand the process, you also have to teach a fan base the value of the process, and you need to establish and maintain through consistency, through communication, that the process matters, that how this is done matters, because that's a big piece of identity, right? Culture is consistency. Without consistencies, there's no culture. And obviously without either, there's no identity.
Well, let's take this a step further when you talk about identity, and maybe it's just easier if we talk about hoops. Identity actually has to have some concrete reality in action, right? And usually when people talk about action and like culture, they're like, oh, we did this community service project and we did this, I don't know, whatever. And it's like
that we had a camera show there for, like,
yeah, just happened to be there.
Come on, man.
It's on Instagram. But I mean, like in what you actually embody on the court. And that's the unique thing about basketball, is that your identity needs to be linked to very specific strategic action, right? Like if you want to be, for example, I use my team now, diversity and unity. We're a very diverse group, right? Because I think we should be.
Define diversity.
You name it.
Yeah.
Skin color, background, how many schools they've been to, what the GPA is, socioeconomic,
how they think, right? Like
perspective where
they
now
think,
we have some.
Exactly.
So but that's how Rowan is. Rowan's a larger state school, so it's a very diverse place, right? I got an engineer on my team right next to somebody who, the only reason they're really going to college is because they want to play ball, right?
Yeah.
They value college. All my guys want to graduate and everything, but really, let's be honest, ball's what's kept them in junior college and whatever. That's a diverse group. Well, that's Rowan. That makes sense for a large state school. That doesn't make sense for every school, right? Well, if you want diversity and unity, you can't then pick a style of basketball that only fits a certain kind of player, right?
Yeah, you're right.
I need to adopt a style of basketball that is eclectic, that has room for everybody.
Yeah, but that to me is what defines the consistency. And that's where when I think I talk about consistency, it's not about like what we do. We check this box, then we just check this box. We are consistent. We are habitual like that. I'm talking about consistency on a deeper level, where it's like who you say you are is what is reflected in everything you do, the good, the bad, right? And that's a big part of it too. Is it's not always pretty. I think that's the thing. People think like, oh, they got great chemistry, they got identity, it must be pretty. No, it doesn't mean that. Families aren't always pretty, right? Like,
well, it should be pretty in the end. But
yeah,
it usually requires some suffering in the process.
Yep.
But it also, the point being though, like,
gosh, if you have that show, real quick to stop. That's actually that's a really deep conversation if you want to have it. Talking about diversity and the challenge of unity with diversity, because that's a sports conversation that this world doesn't want to have. Sports deals with it day in, day out. Right, we came from all different walks. So they do in sports that
they do deal with it, but not. I think sports has the power to. Not every. I mean, every sport does to a certain extent, but especially basketball, right? I mean,
yeah.
But in order to do so, you have to create a system that does, like I said earlier, literally has room for everybody.
True.
And that's what most people, I think, struggle with philosophically, right? This is a philosophical thing for me, that it's difficult to put your finger on it in action.
Well, there's less control too. Far less control.
Way less control.
Yeah.
Right. It's a different kind of control, right? Because it's based on a shared mission. It's based on, for example, like now you can't have too many. If you have too many of the same thing, you no longer have diversity, right? So my rule, like when we're recruiting, is always like, and there's some places you might not be able to do this in the same way, but it just fits where I am now. But I would say we got enough for two. And what I mean by that is like we can have two of something, but past two of something, we're going to get too predictable. We won't be as diverse. right?
God Noah had it figured out. They had it figured
Yeah,
out.
that's
Just
right.
need to.
So, but like, if you give me the facilitator category, I got room for a couple facilitators. If you give me the shooter category, I might take a couple extra of those, but I need everyone to have that skill to a certain extent. Attackers, lefties, righties, the dogs,
Yeah.
the guys who love defending the other team's best player, rebounders, shot blockers. Like you have all these different categories you create. I don't have room for three of those guys, and then I have too much, right? If I have three in the defensive stopper category, I'm usually sacrificing offensively.
Yeah.
Not always, but usually, right? If I have too many of the shooter category, I'm usually sacrificing something defensively, right? So now that might vary depending on where you are, right? What your identity should be, because maybe your identity should be the greatest shooting team in the world that's the world's ever seen. I would love to build a team like that, right? That'd be awesome. Firing away from all cylinders at every single position. Here we come. You better guard this line or else. And we're playing fast, by the way, and we're going to shoot, as the first chance we get, we're taking it at all times. That's fun too. But I like the diversity and the dynamic aspect, I guess, that my team has now, because we can come at you from all angles. We can score in all places, and you don't know who your biggest problem is going to be today. But that requires, if that's, again, that identity is based on who we represent, which, is Rowan, and Rowan's a pretty diverse place. So yeah, we've gotten into some deeper waters here for only episode 3, but I do think it's something that a lot of people, I think a lot of institutions, ironically, they have good statements on their website. Some actually don't. I look at this stuff, right? I there's some institutions that you're like, do you guys even know who you are? You can't have 9 core values. That means you have none, right? What do you actually stand for, right? What do you actually stand for? So, for example,
we stand for everything. We stand for everything, Joe.
So, that's where if you talk about an institution, for example, I just want to say an institution, a community, right? Because you represent a community. It's a community based on a school or a university or college or a sport, a city. But if you look at, I don't know who the example, right? But Philly doesn't have its own mission statement, right? But a university would. This is what we stand for. This is who we are. But then if you talk to someone who worked there for 30 years and lived in that community for 30 years, and you said, is this true? Is this really who they are? Is this really who this community is? Is this really, what is this community actually all about? Now you can start to get to the guts of it, right?
Yeah.
And I think every community has that. Even like I was at Rowan for a couple of years before it was like, I get it now, right? It was almost like I thought I could build a certain kind of team. And then over time, I realized like, no, I probably could, but it would be going against the grain. It wouldn't be going against the wind rather than with the wind, because the identity of this place, and like even Ali, our president, is all about that diversity and, helping kids of all backgrounds, right? Because he has an interesting background. So that has to be core to our identity for us to be great. And the closer I am to that, I think the greater our ceiling is, right? I think that's true for the Eagles. I think it's true for everybody. But I think, ironically, and this is my original point, I get thinking about these things. That's essentially what this podcast should be called, Joe and John Thinking Out Loud.
Yeah, true.
And is like, how many communities, if I were to go in for an interview or something, and I would say like, is this really what you're all about? I'm not sure if they would always know, right? Have they wandered from their mission, or are they true to what they say and have in print?
Well, I also think if your mission is something that was written and conceived in thought and not in action, not in reality, then you got a problem. And that's usually how things go. Like when I was in Los Angeles, I don't know if I ever told you that. Well, I told you I did some speaking, and one of the things was we wanted to get me involved politically. This is a few groups, and I'm not going to say too much because it's just a contentious times. But they wanted me to get involved, And then it got to the point where I said, look, I'm not a politician. I don't play those games. The whole thing, right? He said, well, your speaking's good. Would you ever be interested in writing for someone else? And it was like one of the most appalling things to me. But to me, it also opened the world of this false reality of everything that's projected, where everything's written for people to present. Certain people have to present something that was written for them. So it sounds a certain way, comes across a certain way, gets a certain message off that you don't feel or believe. And I feel like that is kind of taken hold everywhere, where you have a lot of programs, a lot of universities, but the basketball programs, professional organizations do have it, but it is different. They tell you all about what they are and what we're all about. And everything they do tells you otherwise. Everything they are tells you otherwise. But when it does work, when it comes together, like the Eagles this year, to bring it full circle, it works because it's sincere, it's true, it's authentic. And the people are sincere, they're true, they're authentic. And the outcome is kind of like the icing. Like the Eagles season this year, I think there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, they should go to the Super Bowl, but like, this has been awesome. And what's been awesome is not just winning, it's how they win. It's what they represent. It's what they communicate. I always say everything you do communicates something, right? If you wear your hair a certain way, it communicates something. You say something, it communicates something. Everything you do communicates something to someone. And it seems as if everything they communicate is consistent with who and what they really are, which is consistent with who and what Philly really is all about. And I think that's what makes it so fun. The challenge is no one has a real answer for how to get it. Like, Jay Wright, how did you do it? What's the real answer?
Well, I think
outside of time, consistency.
Well, some of it is, you mentioned Jay, right? Like, I think Jay did have enough time. Jay had to switch some gears because he figured it out. And I don't think he got it right away. Right. I think he would agree with that. He'd be an interesting guest to talk about this sometime. So
is it bad that we have to go to our youngest sister to pull that one off?
Yeah, right.
Carly.
So what I would say, that's an interesting comment, right? And I think we only got a couple minutes, but the number one takeaway would just be, when you have this, it's a really special thing to get, right? Like when you have the Eagles winning, I mean, my team's winning, like we're really good. We have a chance to be great. That's really, really special. That's a gift. It's really hard to get. And some of the things don't make sense. Even if you mean to do it, I've meant to do it. That doesn't mean I get to do it, right? Like, how did I get him mixed with him and that mixes right? And why does it mix right? And of course, it takes a lot of work, but it still is a pretty good thing on balance.
Look, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, and Russell Westbrook aren't entitled to a championship. It's got to work.
It's got to work. And I guess the thing for me, I guess, again, you're the commentator, but as a coach, I want to be a master chef. So this is why I think about these things of like it's also personal dynamics. And the way I look at it is like the way you become a master chef is not by choosing all your own recipes and all your own ingredients. It's that you just kind of welcome whatever ingredients come to you, and you have to learn how to figure it out.
You're talking about Lego Movie now. You're talking about being a master builder.
Master builder. That's hilarious. Maybe it is because I have that movie memorized by the amount of times my kids have watched it in the van during the course of their lifetime. Well, isn't that great though? There is some truth to that, right? And the creativity factor, but that's true with anything, art, right?
Yeah. Jazz, man. That's why we always talk about basketball.
Jazz.
It's similar.
And you, as a coach, it's how can I more or less do this on purpose? Because for me, and again, that doesn't always guarantee you're going to have a great season, right? But it can guarantee you having good seasons, right? And being sustainable somewhere. And then, because the good seasons are what lead to the great seasons, right? Just that, and the ones where you just overachieve a little bit lead to the great seasons, especially if you're there for someplace for a long time. But it's like, how can I do this on purpose? And I really do think going back to the identity piece is going back to the story, is understanding the story and being a good reader of a story, and not just taking what maybe an institution used a marketing firm to put things out in the 5-point pillar of thing, but like, what is the actual story? I always thought that, like, when we were at Penn State, who are we really? We say we are.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, what do we mean by that? Because we're also saying who we are not, right, in that statement. So there's so much there. And that's the same thing with, if I was going to be the coach of the Sixers or something, and maybe that's why, like, Harden's on a short string sometimes with Philly fans, because he doesn't always fit. It's also why Ben Simmons was like, one time he showed how soft he was, and they were ready to run. They were like, fine, pay him not to play. Philly fans are like, yeah, we're behind you on this one, right? It's like, you don't fit here. Get the heck out, right? There's some truth to that. So you have to, but again, in order to survive that, some of it is you have to understand the story and fit in where you are. That's what I learned also, by the way, just moving teams so much.
Yeah.
I had to really tap into the story of the team. Where were we here at the beginning of the season? Who's the coach? How long has he been here? Because if I didn't, then I couldn't succeed. So I had to understand all those dynamics. I guess I did kind of develop a odd expertise through all those experiences, because it was just sheer survival, right? I had to survive by figuring out stories. But you can't always just be great where you are. Sometimes you got to figure out whether your story fits with their story, and that makes sense on whether you should be there in the first place or not.
Is that your final thought? You good with that as your final thought?
Yeah, I think that's a good final thought.
I think it's a good
timing
final
is
thought.
good.
I would say, just for me to cap it off, I think something that we might be able to talk about. I talk about feel a lot. We talk a lot about feel in the game, and I think you also need to have feel you have to have a social feel, and part of having a social feel is not imposing yourself on everybody else. And I think a lot of times you see that with coaches getting the job. And this is not a knock on coaches. I think part of it's ambition, and you want to put your stamp on the game, put your stamp on a program, but you can't force yourself on something that isn't you. Right. And I think you see a lot, they see it happen a lot, where they have mediocre success, where it's like, all right, well, it went well, and I got an offer to go take another job, so I'm taking it. Like, that's usually where it goes. And the programs really know better or worse. It was just time we bought, where it's like, you can't really force yourself on something you're not. And the jobs today are so valuable that why wouldn't you? And I think it leads to more failure, quite frankly. I think it leads to more flux in terms of coaching. And the thing I think we value the most is longevity, sustainability, and time is influence. We both are doing what we do because we want to influence in a positive way. We want to influence it in a way that actually makes things better. And time is influence. So if you make better decisions, if you don't force yourself on something you're not, there's a better chance of something succeeding. And there's a lot more to everything beneath the surface, but you also have to have that social feel. You got to feel the place you're at. You've got to understand where you're at. You understand who you are, who you're not, all that stuff. I actually talked a little bit about that in my NIL rant the other day. But there's a lot we can get to. But I think we'll wrap it up now. Do you have a thought on where you want to go next, or are we just going to wing the next one?
Nope. That's the beauty of the whole thing. I think we could get to some, we talked kind of launched in from the Eagles, and we just keep moving into some contemporary things next time. Might be good for 10 minutes. Talk about some specifics of some games we're watching, of maybe some things that I'm working through or whatever. I think that could be applicable.
I also think at some point we got to tackle conference realignment. You and I were so close in the Big Ten. It's like home in so many ways. Played there, obviously I covered the Big Ten for years, and now adding, UCLA and USC, utter craziness in the conference. Kevin Warren, he's out. It's just there's a lot to discuss there, whether we recognize it anymore and whether we will in 20 years. It'll be really interesting. So maybe we can get into some of those things, but if this is a radio tease, I don't know, tune in again to see what we talk about. That's Coach the Commentator
later this week.